Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we are joined by Marshall Auerback, who is a market analyst and research associate at the Levy Institute for Economics at Bard College. Thanks for joining us, Marshall.
Thanks for having me.
So you recently wrote an article entitled "Every Step the EU Takes Toward Financial Unity Sows New Seeds of Its Potential Collapse." So recently the EU released a joint declaration. 750 billion euros are in this recovery plan. As you note in the article, there are some worthwhile policies, but those policies also pose problems for wealthier northern countries, with France caught in the middle. Can you talk about the positive elements of this package, why northern countries oppose it, and France's role in this process?
I think anything that works to reduce the after effects of the pandemic are good. I think anything that works to address climate change is good. I think any kind of public spending built towards reestablishing infrastructure, particularly public health infrastructure, is a good thing. The real problem, as usual, with the European Union is the scale. You're looking at a package which is less than 2% of total GDP in aggregate. And if you look at the scale of the collapses in many of these countries, Italy is forecast to, its GDP will probably forecast by about close to 13% this year. Same with Spain. Even a country like Germany, which is considered to have had a good crisis, quote unquote, will probably see its economy collapse by about 8.5%. France will also be very adversely affected. 12.5% decline is the forecast. So it's also pretty ugly. And really, again, it comes back to the institutional problems. You have this construction of a single currency union without a supranational treasury to go with it, which means that you can't just automatically extend fiscal assistance to a state in need the way you say you can, at least in theory in the US. It's not being done very well here either, but for different reasons, or a Canadian province. So every country still has its own fiscal policies, and you have to secure agreement amongst 27 different countries. And those that aren't doing as badly, like the wealthier northern countries, said, well, hang on, we'll give them loans. We don't want to give them too many free grants because we still think they'll waste the money and they should have to pay it back. So that's really, it goes back to the long-standing institutional problems which have afflicted the European Union from day one.
In France's role within that?
Well, Emmanuel Macron, the French president, was a leading player. I mean, let's take a step further back. I mean, the Franco-German axis has long been the focal point around which the whole European Union has turned. So generally, when you get initiatives coming from both France and Germany, that's significant. And I think Emmanuel Macron, in particular, has been quite aggressive in terms of trying to force the European Union to start federalizing or mutualizing its debt in the same way that, say, Alexander Hamilton was able to assume all the state's debts and thereby create a national treasury function of sorts. And he has not been able to get Germany to go along with this in any substantial way. There's been sort of slight nudges along the way. The European Commission, for example, which is the executive body of the European Union, will now be able to raise money independently of the national state governments for these programs, which is a good thing. But you still haven't got the so-called Hamiltonian moment where it's all taken on by a supranational entity, which would, I think, helps to solve the problem of fiscal austerity, which is still afflicting all of these countries. And France, actually, even though it has pretensions of being a great global power these days, is actually almost as badly affected as Italy or Spain. And so it's likely to be in the position soon of having to make an existential choice. Does it preserve that link, that strong institutional link with Germany, but at a cost of destroying its national economy? Or does it start to align its interests more with the Mediterranean countries like Italy, Spain, Greece, etc.?
And Macron, in the meantime, is offered a series of austerity packages for France, for workers within France. So you have this contradiction that he's trying to play this mediating role on the larger scale within the European Union, but then at home enacting all sorts of austerity. And as you note, of course, the French people have not taken that lightly. We've seen the Yellow Vest movement. We've seen unions fighting back. Right. And we can expect more of that, I'm assuming.
Yeah, I think if he goes on with, say, the pension, he's deferred things like the pensions reforms that he's talked about. And I expect that if he tries to resume those quote unquote reforms, he will have people on the streets pretty aggressively sometime in the not too distant future. And yes, you're right. He has these great impulses as far as the European Union goes, and yet he's very much a neoliberal. He's a market fundamentalist in the same way that many of the center-left parties in Europe are right now. He's not a real social democrat. So he's hoisted on a petard of his own internal contradictions, as you note.
And it seems to me that the backlash to those austerity programs, as you also mentioned in the article, it's not that it has to take the form of, say, a left-wing sort of international anti-austerity movement. I mean, this could very well take the form in increased hyper-nationalist right-wing elements, political parties and political movements that would even create further destabilization, not just internally, but throughout the continent.
Yeah, I mean, it's ironic because, as I said, the center left, which is where you'd sort of expect to see these kind of progressive initiatives emanating from, has largely been co-opted by what I would call the Brussels neoliberal agenda. It's technocracy run amok, and it very much has a pro-austerity bias. And the people that have been most forceful in terms of campaigning against this have been right-wing populists like Marine Le Pen, for example, in France, but also people like Viktor Orban in Hungary and also in Poland. Unfortunately, they come with a host of other unsavory baggage to go with it. Historically, a lot of racism, and so it's their politics is extremely divisive. And of course, a country like Germany, another one, you don't really want to see a rise of right-wing populism again, because we haven't had a particularly happy history of that in the past as well. So this is one of the things that's, I think, got to be resolved, that the left has got to come up with a different model in opposition to what the prevailing ideology is in Europe right now.
What do you think that model is? I mean, we follow and have spoken with other analysts, people like Yanis Varoufakis, others from the EU. What is your thinking? I mean, you mentioned in the article that incrementalism isn't going to cut it in this context. What would be like the significant steps that you would recommend that we could take in the short term?
Yanis is a friend, and I largely agree with him ideologically. I think that going for grand institutional fixes right now is very problematic. But what I have suggested in the past is something akin to per capita revenue sharing distributions that one could theoretically do here in the U.S. And I would like to see the European Central Bank effectively create additional euros and just make per capita distributions to the various Eurozone countries. They probably could do that under the existing treaty strictures, which are in the Maastricht Treaty. So it wouldn't entail any great institutional reforms. And the other good thing about it is that every country would benefit. Germany, for example, would be the largest beneficiary because it would receive, as the largest economy, it would be receiving the largest per capita distribution. So I think that's something that has yet to be tried. I suggested this about 10 years ago to someone who worked in the ECB, and he said that it made sense economically, but politically we weren't there yet, and that we had to go through a few more crises before that point would be that kind of an argument would be accepted. I think we're closer to that now, especially next year when I think the second or third order effects of this pandemic are likely to be manifested in Europe as a whole.
And do you think your sort of aversion to those grand institutional fixes is that's not ideological? Is that more of a practical political point?
Yeah, it's practical.
Right? Okay.
Look, to me, the historical analogy I've often used with Europe is the United States, in the sense that, that when this country was formed in 1776, you had the Articles of Confederation, and effectively you had a model very similar to what you've got now in Europe. You had a weak central government with minimal taxing authority, and the states were able to had their own debts, and you had the strong states like Virginia and the fiscally weak states like, for example, New York. And it wasn't until you had that institutional fix made that you were able to solve the problems and create a real United States of America. But that took a number of years of running amidst great economic instability. It took a constitutional convention, which took several years to come to a consensus. And now
two wars.
Yeah, and some wars, and so it's very, very difficult to do. And of course, you were dealing with 13 colonies, 13 states. Here you're dealing with 27 countries, because even though they're not all in the Eurozone, they all have to come to an agreement to make the kinds of institutional changes that you would need to make to the Maastricht Treaty. So I just think we're not there yet, and certainly you could argue that the Europe of that has been created in the last years. Part of the problems have come because of trying to push too hard on one end of it, the currency union, at the expense of others, and so I think there'd be a reaction if you went for another grand institutional change that would engender a lot of opposition.
Our good friend Christian Parenti just recently wrote a book called Radical Hamilton. I think you would enjoy it.
I read the review about it. Yes, I think she makes a lot of good points, and. I don't think there's anything, what's interesting about that is I don't think there's anything fundamentally antithetical to the American and indeed to the European traditions about using having a strong state component to do national industrial policy. And I still think the state is the best level at which to do that, as opposed to a super state or a supranational structure. And ironically, the countries that are heirs to that tradition, are countries like Germany, France, who were big. Friedrich List, who was a big proponent of economic development and using the state as a major factor in creating that kind of national prosperity, and yet they are repudiating that tradition now. They sound more like the free market. Libertarians that you get here in the U.S. and upholding the sanctity of market fundamentalism, which is kind of ironic. Ironically, where you are seeing that kind of push towards more national developmentalism is in the UK under the Conservative administration of Boris Johnson.
Right. No, and I mean we see
and they're
this.
Leaving.
Yeah, and we're going to get to the article about Biden in the U.S. context, but this seems so contradictory even in the U.S. I mean, it would seem to me, and I'm ignorant, I'm not an economic analyst, I'm not an economist, but it would seem to me that it would benefit even the capitalists to enact the kind of social economic programs that would give people a little bit of a break on healthcare, allow people more money in their pockets to spend. I mean, this ideology, I think best expressed by like maybe a Mitch McConnell, it seems so self-defeating, and it seems as though some of the people who would support their political project would be hurting their own material interests by doing so. I mean, how do you sort of explain this crazy contradiction?
Well, I think it's in part a problem of the fact that a lot of these guys just don't think beyond the next couple of years. That they see this big trough and they want to just get as much from it, and they don't really think of the broader economic consequences. I mean, it was the same thing in the 1930s. You had some wealthy, what we would call the elites or the oligarchs of those days, who supported FDR, like Bernard Baruch, and recognized that you had to give up a larger slice of pie in order to sustain the whole pie altogether. But an even larger number still opposed him vociferously. And I think, you get people that when they're in their own little bubble, and they're doing extremely well, and they don't see the bigger picture, and they just see their interests under attack, and they fight back instinctively against that. So I agree, it's highly corrosive and it's highly destructive, but that just seems to be the way it is.
And you think that that's largely due to their sort of personal political interests? I mean, how much of this, because you mentioned this playing out in the EU as well, how much of this is that sort of Austrian economic ideology has seeped into the sort of politic that we're in? I mean, how much of this is that people believe this?
I'm not sure it's Austrian economics per se, but certainly neoliberalism, I would say, has been a big factor. I just think that you've got that this tremendous belief that the market is the optimal market fundamentalism is the optimal way to promote economic development. The state's role should be limited to creating rent-free, efficient markets and playing the role of umpire, which I happen to disagree with. And that's really contrary to the European tradition as a whole until the 1980s and beyond, when that's all started to change, and likewise here in the US. And it's unfortunate, but and then of course in Germany specifically, you have the historic memory of Weimar and hyperinflation, so that has historically biased their fiscal policies towards austerity. I think that's been another problem, and they've managed to, if you like, suffuse that ideology throughout the European Union because they are the dominant economy.
And you mentioned that there's sort of a third wave. I'm just working off of what you had said before, that there would be like sort of a third phase to this pandemic economic crash that we've faced next year. What should we be looking out for over the next year or so in this development in the EU?
Well, it's not just the EU. I think it's everywhere. The longer that you've had these, the impacts of these of the pandemic has gone on, the longer you've had forms of economic restriction. I'm not going to get into a debate as to whether they were good or bad, but we've had them, and I think the longer they last for, the more you have what economists like to call hysteresis, which is that you have short-run problems become long-term in nature. And so many of these jobs have been destroyed for good, whether that be, say, in the service industries like restaurants, leisure, tourism, also aviation, the hotel industry. That's literally tens of millions of jobs that aren't going to be coming back, and the ongoing. So there's going to be an ongoing challenge beyond the immediate. Even if we get a vaccine and we solve the pandemic, you're still going to have to deal with the reconstruction of these economies to deal with that broader challenge, which is going to be very, very profound, I think.
Do you think there's an opportunity to fundamentally restructure those economics? In other words, we have a lot of friends who work in the service sector industry, and they fucking hate it. I mean, they hate every minute of it because it's non-unionized, low-wage, shit work, no benefits, so on and so. Especially here in the U.S., I'm speaking specifically from our context.
But it's getting like that way in the UK, in Europe as well. So it's potentially, as you say, like when you tear down a structure, you can rebuild something that's way better, or you can just try to recreate what you had before. That's a political choice. So absolutely, I think there's a lot of things we could do to make our economies better and to work more favorably for a broader number of people. But I don't see any evidence yet that leading policymakers on either side of the Atlantic are ready to do that.
No, and that gets to the second article I wanted to talk about today that you wrote. Even if Biden wins in a blowout, which I think many of us are hoping for any number of reasons, the economy still isn't coming back. In this article, you describe this sort of changing geopolitical landscape, that the United States unipolar moment is over, that we're moving into a multipolar world, and it's been that way, in fact, as you argued, sort of for the last 3 or 4 decades, more and more moving into that direction. Yeah. We have Joe Biden or Donald Trump. I think, and I'm sure you would argue, that it makes sense, strategic sense, to get Trump out of office and to get Joe Biden in office. But all of us, I think, understand the limitations of Joe Biden, what he represents, and not just him, but where the Democratic Party sits ideologically and politically, where the Republican Party sits in the sort of total paralyzation that we've experienced here in the U.S. politically. So, in other words, we always hear analysts say, "Oh, these would be the nice things that should happen if we want to make things better," And then I think a lot of us look at the political situation and go, well, none of those are viable in this situation. Like nobody's going to take those up. So then what is what would be the result if indeed these parties and these politicians decide not to do those things? And it seems to me that Joe Biden, without massive political pressure from below, isn't going to offer the kind of economic programs that would make a significant difference.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, I think there is a priority to. There's a risk of another 4 years of Trump that you don't have a democracy after that to begin with. So I can understand the imperative of getting him out of office. That said, he did challenge a lot of the existing shibboleths and truisms that have governed this country for many decades, and so in the course of wrecking them or breaking a lot of taboo subjects, he's at least opened up the scope of possible debate, as has the pandemic. For example, if you had discussed a single-payer healthcare system just as recently as 3 or 4 years ago, that would have been considered a crazy idea, far too radical. I think now, in the midst of a pandemic, you can see why there are many advantages to having a system that provides Medicare to everyone and isn't linked, and then where healthcare doesn't become a condition of employment. Because if you've got 30 million or so Americans that are sick and they don't have access to insurance and they don't have access to treatment, then that runs contrary to even being able to deal with the pandemic. But yeah, I mean, there's got to be continued pressure on Biden. My fear is that if he does disappoint, that you could get a more extreme version from the right the next time around. And next time, the worry is that you get someone who's actually competent in terms of knowing how to use the levers of government to achieve a much more radically right agenda. I mean, I have in mind someone like a Tom Cotton, for example, who who's a smart guy, dangerously smart, but certainly knows how to push and pull the levers in a way that Trump clearly does not. And that's the real risk if Biden disappoints again.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, and I would argue for those watching and listening that a lot of that is also contingent upon what labor unions do, what students do, what workers
What's
do.
left of labor unions, that is. I mean, that's another thing. I think we need to have some sort of restructuring of the work environment, if not to recreate labor unions, at least to create work councils, some form of co-determinism like you have in Germany. You need to rebalance the economic power in this country if you're going to make a start at solving our problems.
And you think that would start at the workplace?
Yes, I'd like to see that. I'm not necessarily against a big business per se. I think there's big businesses have more capacity to provide generous health and welfare benefits than a smaller business can. So I have no problem about that, but I think you need a stronger countervailing policy on the other side, a countervailing institution on the other side. You had that in the 1960s and 70s, what's known as tripartitism. A big business meeting with big labor. Something like it was the UAW, for example, that was a major force for progressivism under Walter Reuter, and I'd like to see that kind of a structure being recreated in some form or another.
And you mentioned Medicare for all. It would seem in this context of a pandemic, tens of millions of people being kicked off of out of their jobs, losing their healthcare insurance, that it reminds me of what we talked about with the EU, which is that it would seem to me that it would make sense for U.S. firms and companies to lobby for Medicare for all.
Yeah, that's always been my belief. I've always said, why do you want to put American businesses at a global competitive disadvantage by making healthcare a marginal cost of doing business here in the United States? Whenever I hear people, they would say, "Oh, I remember being on Fox one time, and they started with the usual talking points about how Obamacare was just adding enormous incremental costs to small and large businesses alike." And I said, "Yeah, I agree with you," and that's exactly why I'd like to see a single payer system introduced, because I'd like to get those costs taken out of the hands of businesses and just become a public good. And I think also it not only should it not be a condition of employment, but you have a healthcare system that's skewed towards for profit and not necessarily optimal health outcomes, which is why, even though this country spend so much more on GDP as healthcare as a percentage of GDP. It's about 15% right now. The health outcomes are pretty poor relative to other countries that do have single-payer systems and spend a lot less money on as a percentage of GDP on healthcare.
As life expectancy goes down in the U.S.
Yeah, exactly.
With this sort of changing, this changing of America's unipolar moment, moving to a multipolar moment in history, I'm thinking here of Alfred McCoy's book, The Historian from the University of Wisconsin. It's called The Twilight of the American Century. It's a great book about this very topic. You note that economies in Asia, as they have for the past 40 years, continue to mature. America's military and sort of technological dominance is slipping away, with China in particular posing a serious challenge. You talk about Japan's role in this and the role that they've played vis-a-vis U.S. hegemony sort of since the post-World War II era.
I do think. I mean, we've had these long historic ties with Japan by virtue of the fact that we beat them in World War II and effectively occupied the country. I just think that longer term, it's inevitable that Japan will have to find some sort of accommodation with China. I mean, you're talking about an economy of 1.4 billion people versus an economy that's only got a population of 120 million. Their interests longer term will be increasingly aligned with those of other Asian countries. And, we should accept that and accept that there will be, the world is going to likely devolve into regional spheres of influence. The U.S. will probably be a dominant player in North America, indeed most of the Western Hemisphere. Europe will go its own way, and Asia will likely go its own way. But to expect, as I said in the article, I think I said that to expect us using Japan to contain China, that's a bit like asking the Russians to use Canada to contain the United States. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And, there's nothing wrong with life post-hegemony. The Italians for many centuries lived very well, even after the Roman Empire, and we can learn to accept that as well.
I agree with you. This also circles back around to the EU. It's not just Japan that's being sort of moved into the sphere of influence, but that there's European nations who are also striking up economic and political agreements with China. You mentioned particularly Italy, who was the first to join the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yes, exactly. Well, again, this points to the, this is another problem with the short-sightedness of European Union policy. I mean, the Italians are now taking aid from China because, as they said, they'll take it from wherever they can to help restore growth. That does create geostrategic challenges for Europe in the sense that this is NATO's southern flank. Do you really want the Chinese also have very significant interests over in the Greek port of Piraeus as well. So this has got to might start to alarm members of NATO, for example. But again, can you blame the Chinese if Europe doesn't work to restore some degree of economic prosperity in places like southern Mediterranean, Greece, Italy? Then of course they'll look elsewhere for help, and China would be more than willing to extend its sphere of influence within crucial parts of Europe.
What do you think is the sort of balance that could be struck between national economic concerns and developing these regional economic bodies? Are there sort of guiding principles that you would suggest for politicians, people who are going to be making those decisions? Or is there sort of what would be the framework that you would think about this in? Because we see it in the United States, and you mentioned it at the end of your article. It's not just now, and in the light of the pandemic, what worries me is that it's not just Trump and the Republicans who are now talking about economic nationalism. There's a significant portion of liberal thinkers and even progressive thinkers who are sort of peppering some of their analysis or suggestions with this sort of economic nationalism. How could that, is there a way to balance the two? And if so, what does that look like?
I guess, it's, economic nationalism is a bit of a loaded term, but I would say that there's nothing wrong with national industrial policy. I've never really like the idea that we just outsource all of our manufacturing to Asia. I mean that leads to a race to the bottom. You not only destroy communities in the U.S. It's called the Rust Belt for a reason, and it's not a good reason.
Yeah.
But
we live
but
there,
also,
so I hear you.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I have a lot of friends in that part of the world. But it's so you want to make sure that you redomicile manufacturing so that you're not only so you don't have these supply chain vulnerabilities going forward, but that so you can reestablish high quality jobs in the United States. And okay, now the purists, the free trade purists would say, well, you should let the market sort this out and allow the markets to make the adjustments and retrain people, et cetera, et cetera. Except that my argument has been that, well, we've tried that for 40 years and it doesn't seem to be working. Trade is fundamentally, in my opinion, a distributional issue. It's benefited a certain class of the population. And to my way of thinking is that, look, if it means you're spending $500 more for your car or your flat screen TV, but the quid pro quo is that you have a vibrant manufacturing sector with a bunch of high quality jobs that are here in the United States, I think that's a very, very good trade-off. Because relative GDP, that doesn't really matter to you or me. I mean, we don't experience that subjectively. If our own standard of living are getting better, we don't care if it means that, because you're doing trade this way, your GDP is only growing, say, at 2.5% rather than 3% a year. It's less efficient. There are other goals in life other than efficiency, and I think that's something that we have to learn. I mean, to give an example, immigration. I mean, it's a very emotive topic, but what I would say about immigration is that when we don't have open borders, even though that, supposedly the migration of people would give us the lowest cost labor in theory, if people are just moving back and forth from one spot to another. But, we have other things that are considered priorities as well. Social cohesion, cultural cohesion, national security. Those are all factors which mitigate against. That's why we have an immigration policy. So you say, well, there are other considerations beyond the lowest and most efficient cost of labor. So why is trade so sacrosanct? Why is it that traded goods these considerations don't apply for that, especially since today's trade agreements now don't really deal with manufactured goods anymore. They deal with services which effectively entrench the positions of oligopolies and multinational corporations. That's what really happens.
Do you think it's a mistake for the left to not talk about immigration and just sort of leave that as a topic of the right? And then the sort of counter reaction being just open all the borders and just let it go?
Yeah, and look, I don't think that, I think that it's the left's often, their views are often mischaracterized as being open borders liberalism. I don't think that's right, but I do think we've come a long way from the days of the Barbara Jordan Commission from the 1990s, where she prioritized. She did say you had to look at the effect of immigration on our most vulnerable, and I do feel that there's nothing wrong with moving towards a Canadian-style point system where you prioritize skill, where you do have some restriction for a few years to tighten up the labor markets, precisely because I do want to help those at the lower end of the economic scale. And again, our immigration system is very much geared towards facilitating the benefits largely accrue to the upper tier, not to the lower tier. The H-1B visa being a classic example, where you just effectively use that visa, you abuse it, and effectively replace domestic labor with lower cost international labor.
And I say that as sort of a dyed-in-the-wool lefty. So I say that because we have a lot of friends who will say things like, they just kind of blow it off as a non-issue. It's like, and it comes from a good place. A lot of the people who say those things, have a strong moral center where they're saying, look, we have the resources, we have the money. Why can't we take these people in? Why can't we take care of them, et cetera, et cetera? And I think there are obviously distinctions between refugees, between people seeking exile, and so forth. But it's just been frustrating because this has now been an issue that's largely dominated by the right. And I feel like we have to develop some kind of a coherent counterbalance to their, their ideology.
I agree. Well, as I say, Canada is a net, I think 1.5% net immigration every year comes into the country, but they do tend to prioritize skill, their point system, and I think we have to do the same thing. It's not an absolute right to come into this country, and you have to do it in a way that benefits the people that live here. And it's not, and I don't say that you do that on the basis of race, so certainly not racial quotas. I don't care which country they come from, but it should be very much skills based, so that there's a net benefit to more of us.
And in the U.S., we have obviously the U.S. has a military empire. So 53 cents of every discretionary dollar is being spent on the U.S. military empire. A significant portion of manufacturing, et cetera, the jobs that remain here in Northwest Indiana are largely jobs. Those that do still exist in factories and manufacturing plants are largely for military equipment. Mm-hmm. How do you think the role of how do I put this question? What do you think the role of U.S. empire is, U.S. militarism, in this context of a multipolar world? My concern would be that the U.S. sort of lashes out at this changing economic landscape and political landscape, understanding that the one hegemonic power that we still have left would be our military force.
Yeah, I think that's a risk, and I think that it's a problem that these relics of the Cold War are still being embraced as the status quo, and that seems to be across the political divide. I mean, to me, it's ironic that it's somewhat alarming that so many of the country's neocons, the guys that got us into a lot of these wars, are gravitating to the Biden camp. So I do get concerned about that. But look, if we're going to have a significant amount of military expenditure, I'd at least like to see the military being used in a way that it was, several decades ago, whereby, for example, like Semitech, which is the semiconductor consortium that was established in the 1980s because it was felt that the U.S. was developing a strategic vulnerability in the design and construction of semiconductors. That was a government, and that was largely driven by military and national security concerns. That was a government-led consortium that actually revived the semiconductor industry in the United States. And by the same token, we could have the military creating markets for products by saying, if you provide me with this kind of a vehicle that can do A, B, C, and D, I can guarantee you a market of X million vehicles. I mean, so I'd like to see it more closely melded towards having a dual use structure, where you can derive more civilian benefits from it. And we don't do that enough.
And even outside of the economic sphere, say even with regard to climate change, it would seem to me with the kind of equipment, being a former Marine myself and having spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, it's like, I look at the amount of equipment, logistical capacity, technologies that exist, the over 1,000 military bases that are around the world. Now, some of the places that they're located, people don't want those military bases anymore. Yeah. But for those who would be willing to sort of keep them there, is like climate centers or centers to like keep track of what's happening with changing climates and biospheres and ecologies and so forth. Things like that seem to me to make a lot of sense. The problem that I can see is that of all the issues we're having a robust discussion and debate about in the United States, some more than others, the one issue that still remains completely off the table is U.S. empire and a real discussion about it.
Right. That's right, and in fact, the military budget, it never gets cut. I mean, even in the post-Cold War period, the rate of growth might have slowed, but it never gets cut, and the military has worked the system very, very well. They ensure that they've got bases and all sorts of production all spread across all the different states. So you get a nice bit of political engineering so that, if you start talking about cuts, they will immediately start introducing cuts or threaten to introduce cuts to the most politically sensitive. So they'll say, well, too bad about that naval base in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which has created, several hundred jobs, or, this air base out in California, we're going to have to cut that back. So yeah, you want to reorient the country's considerable fiscal resources towards other things other than military and empire. And as you say, it's because ultimately it is problematic, and it's not good for our national security to have a weakened industrial hollow shell where all we do is produce military goods.
No, and we see that playing out politically, domestically, where we live, where there's a tremendous, upsurge, and has been for the last 4 years, of right-wing nationalist groups, racist organizations, and all kinds of very militant right-wing groups that pose a number of problems for people not just socially, but politically, economically, and so on.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the more that you have the military becoming the predominant entity in terms of manufacturing, it actually starts to degrade the civilian economy. I mean, you could see that, for example, in Boeing. Boeing used to be synonymous with great civil engineering, but they've been having real problems with the 737 and more and less, and then before that the 787. But part of the problem is that you had the military get its paws into the company, and they merged it with McDonnell Douglas years ago, and that whole military culture began to suffuse the company's work ethic and how they built things, and I think started to create a situation where they were producing lousy planes, which in turn meant that they lost market share to Airbus. Just as an example.
Do you think that there's still, and I know we're running out of time, but I want to ask you if you think that there seems to be on the left, I think before Donald Trump, there was this sense of like, we're moving into a world where nation states don't matter as much. Multinational corporations are the sort of dominant political economic force. Nation states are sort of these vessels that corporations use. I think that was the dominant sort of theme that was being.
Has been for. I mean, if you ever read, I don't know if you're familiar with the film Network. There's that great scene of Ned Beatty's when he makes exactly the same speech from the right. Interestingly enough,
right.
And that was '76. I think that film was made. So, I think the death of the nation state has been vastly overstated, and I think it's. I think the further we get away from national, indeed local structures, the less democratic we become. And that, and these, my concern has always been of these large global entities, whether that be the World Trade Organization or other areas, that policy becomes more technocratic and it becomes less politically accountable. And that you start seeing policy being made on behalf of large oligopolies and multinationals rather than for the average person. You never see a World Trade Agreement that actually talks about, for example, harmonization of labor standards. They'll talk about harmonization of industrial standards because they want to have especially if they're the dominant country in regard to a particular standards. Or they talk about protection of intellectual property rights, but they won't talk about tax harmonization policies. Those things right there show you the biases that are implicit in these globalist institutions.
In those institutions, the last question I'll have for you is that it's not that you don't think we should have such institutions, but that we've put too much power in those institutions' hands, and that, in other words, the way I'm thinking about this, particularly in the context
of mission creep, I would say.
Okay,
that's what tends to happen. And I think you can pull back. I mean, as I said before, the WTO used to be GATT, and that dealt with the liberalization of traded goods. But now we're no longer doing that anymore. Now we're talking about services and we're talking about issues that have very, very little to do with trade and very much to do with privileging certain multinational corporations. And I think that's where it needs to be rolled back a bit.
And for an issue like climate change, do you think that we should create new sort of superstructure institutions internationally, or do you think that there's agreements that nation states could come up with that would also deal with those issues?
I think that's what I say is where a global solution is necessary, then you should work towards that. But again, the Paris Accord, despite its limitations, is a considerable achievement, and that was a group of nations working together under the auspices of the UN to achieve an objective. And I think that was a very, very important thing to do. So in those kinds of situations, I definitely like the idea of seeing, global cooperation. But, you can have the cooperation still, or the accountability still residing at the national level. I don't believe in world government. I just think that's unworkable. And, look, our own national government is hugely dysfunctional right now. How do we expect to work better if we have a United States of a global United States of the world kind of thing?
We make the same argument to our activist friends who try and engage in large national projects and we say, hey, what's going on locally? And they say, our local town's a disaster. And we say, well, before we work on a statewide project, maybe we should get our shit together at the local level.
Yeah, that's right. Like Voltaire says, you got to cultivate your own garden first. So
I appreciate your time, Marshall. I just became aware of your work, so I apologize for my ignorance, but I've really enjoyed going through your articles, and I'm glad to see you sort of more and more out there. So yeah.
Well, it's partly because of people like you that are hearing it and disseminating it. So I'm very appreciative. So thank you.
You're welcome. Well, thanks for your time today, Marshall, and we'll talk again.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
All right. Take care. You've been watching Park Media. I'm your host today, Vince Emanuele, and we'll talk soon. Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parkmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Park Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.